I found an ad on Zillow for a shared apartment near the chicken farm where I worked. It was super convenient, already furnished and close to my job. All I had to bring was my clothes and a mini dresser. The spare room even had a bed ready for me. The guy renting out the room was an older man around 70 named Ben. It was a week-to-week arrangement, no contract, so I paid him cash every week. He was technically my roommate, but he was old-fashioned and kept to himself. For someone like me, who didn't come from a wealthy family, this place was a steal. One night after a long day at work, I crashed into bed and fell asleep almost instantly. But I woke up suddenly to my bedroom door creaking open. Light from the hallway spilled in, and there stood Ben, his hand on the doorknob. In a deep, hoarse voice, he said, "Stay out of the basement." He claimed he knew I'd been down there. I defended myself, telling him I hadn't, because I really hadn't. He shut the door and walked away. I sat there thinking, this guy's unstable or something. The next day I was off work. Ben took his old car and drove off, probably to the store. With the house to myself, I couldn't stop staring at the basement door. I'd seen him go down there before, but I'd never been inside. His weird warning the night before made me curious. I figured he wouldn't be back for a while, so I decided to take a quick look. I opened the basement door and found the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. At first glance, it seemed like a normal basement, but then I noticed a door in the corner. It was hard to open. There was some kind of rubber seal underneath, probably to keep the smell from leaking out. And oh, the smell. It was awful. Inside that little room was a nightmare. Bloodstains covered the concrete floor, and there were black bags stacked in the corner, big enough to hold bodies or body parts. The stench of rot hit me like a wall, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. I noticed a camera mounted in the top corner, aimed at a workbench. I snapped a quick photo, then bolted back upstairs. I packed all my clothes into a garbage bag and heard the front door slam shut. Ben was back. I tried to act normal, greeting him from the hallway, but he didn't respond. Instead, I heard him head straight for the basement. That was my cue. I grabbed my bag, sprinted to my car, and drove off without looking back. I drove 15 miles to my brother's farm and showed him the photo. He called me an idiot for not calling the sheriff right away, so I dialed 911 and told them everything. I made it clear I was just a temporary tenant and had stumbled across something horrifying. I asked them to bring a search warrant to Ben's address before he could clean up the evidence. A few hours later, a deputy showed up at my brother's farm. They took my ID and some information, then gave me the good news. Ben had been arrested. He'd been trying to clear out the basement, but he wasn't fast enough. The deputies didn't go into detail about what they found in those bags, and I didn't ask. They thanked me and left. I stayed with my brother for a few weeks until I was ready to find another place. That whole experience was a nightmare, but at least it was over. When I was 22, I landed a job in New York City. I was living in Jersey at the time, but there was no way I could handle that daily commute. Moving to the city was my only option. The problem? I didn't have much money. So, when I stumbled across an ad on Craigslist for a cheap bedroom in an apartment in Hell's Kitchen, I didn't think twice. I jumped on it. The next day, I went to check out the place. The landlord gave me a quick tour. He seemed a little awkward, but I didn't think much of it. Everything looked fine, until he mentioned the catch. I'd have a roommate. The landlord assured me this guy, Bren, was super quiet and kept to himself. Sounded perfect, right? Bren wasn't around when I visited, though. The landlord knocked on his door, but there was no answer. He guessed Bren might be napping. I didn't think much of it, and decided to take the room. I filled out an application, and the next day, the landlord called to say the room was mine. A week later, I moved in. My dad helped me unload all my stuff into my new room. The weird part, Bren never came out to say hello. We could hear him moving around in his room, but he didn't show his face. I started to get the feeling he wasn't exactly the friendly type. After my dad left, I was officially on my own. I sat on my bed, started watching Netflix, and tried to relax. Then, I heard Bren's door open and close. Finally, I thought this was my chance to introduce myself. I got up, but before I could even reach my bedroom door, the front door slammed shut. I stepped into the living room and no one was there. What was Bren's deal? I figured we'd have to meet eventually, so I didn't stress too much. I went back to my room, ate some ramen, and went to sleep. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of the front door closing again. Then, I heard footsteps. They creaked across the wooden floor, stopping right outside my door. I sat up and saw the outline of feet under the door. Why was he just standing there like a creep? I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to leave. Thankfully, he did. But all night I heard strange thumps coming from his room. I had no idea what he was doing, but I was too nervous to confront him. I hadn't even met the guy yet. The next morning, Bren seemed to be gone. Maybe at work. I spent the day shopping for groceries and apartment essentials. When I got back, I dropped everything on the couch and relaxed for a bit. I cooked dinner, watched some Netflix, and noticed Bren still hadn't come home. Later, I ran to the 7-Eleven to grab toothpaste. When I returned, I saw Bren's door was slightly open and the light was on. I thought, this is it. Time to finally meet him. I knocked twice and pushed the door open. What I saw, or rather what I didn't see, left me stunned. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, just a single chair in the corner, like the kind you'd find in a high school classroom. My heart started racing and I began to shake. I turned off the light, shut the door, and tried to convince myself Bren was in the process of moving out. But deep down, I knew something was off. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on my bed. My head was pounding. I decided to call the landlord to figure out what was going on. As soon as I dialed his number, I heard a loud ringing sound coming from my closet. My heart dropped. The phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. That's when it hit me. The landlord had declined my call. He was in my closet. There was no Bren. It was all a lie. I ran to the bathroom, locked myself in, and called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the apartment. Sure enough, they found the landlord hiding under my bed. I tried to press charges and get out of the lease, but it turned out there was no lease. He wasn't even the real landlord. He didn't own the apartment. I never found out how he got the keys. The next day, my dad came to help me move all my stuff back home. A week later, I found another apartment. The whole experience was a nightmare, and moving twice in such a short time was a huge hassle. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. The landlord gave off bad vibes from the start. But who could have predicted something this crazy would happen? If you've ever been to college, you probably remember that first day in your dorm, meeting your roommate, the person you're supposed to live with, and ideally get along with for the next 4 years. I definitely remember mine. I walked into my dorm for the first time, and there he was, fair skin, black hair, glasses, and a slightly feminine voice. There was nothing wrong with any of that, but he immediately struck me as the gaming type, which wasn't really my vibe. Let's call him John for this story. From the moment we shook hands, his handshake was like a dead fish. I was a little put off. I left the room to meet other kids on the floor and instantly clicked with some of them more than I did with John. That first night, I tried to get to know him a bit. He wasn't mean, but he didn't seem to know how to hold a conversation. I'd ask him questions and he'd give me one-word answers or responses that didn't make much sense. He even went to bed super early, turning off his lamp at 10 p.m. No one had classes the next day, so I found it weird. I stayed up watching videos on my phone with headphones until around midnight, then went to sleep. The next morning, a few guys from my floor and I went to the dining hall together. When I got back to the room, I noticed my duffel bag had been moved. John was sitting on his bed, and I immediately checked my bag. It felt lighter, but I couldn't figure out what was missing. I straight up accused John of going through my stuff, but he denied it aggressively. What could I do? There were no cameras in the room, so I had no proof. That night, I invited John to hang out with me and some other kids from the floor, but he said no, claiming he needed to stay on top of his work. I went out without him, and when I got back, he was already asleep. It was late, so I went straight to bed. A storm rolled in, and I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of thunder. I was too lazy to look outside, but even with my eyes closed, I noticed the constant flashes of lightning. It actually helped me fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to find my backpack open and moved. This time, I didn't accuse John. Instead, I decided to stay up that night and see what he was doing. After a long, rainy day, I pretended to go to bed early. I stayed on my phone for a while, listening to the rain outside. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I flipped onto my side and pretended to be asleep. After a while, I noticed flashes again, but they weren't lightning. I turned over and saw John sitting upright in his bed, quickly lowering his arms. It hit me. He was taking pictures of me. I played dumb and asked, "What are you doing?" He stuttered and said he couldn't sleep. The next day, I told the other kids on the floor about it and how weird John was. They agreed I should request a room change. Later, when I went back to the room, John was gone for once. His laptop was on his bed, lid slightly open. I couldn't resist. I had to snoop. His desktop was a mess, filled with folders, programs, and images. I started opening random pictures, and most of them were weird. But then I found the disturbing ones. Pictures of me. One was a photo of me in bed, taken with an iPhone flash. He'd stored all the pictures he'd taken of me on his computer, including shots of my duffel bag and the inside of my backpack. I took a video of his laptop screen, deleted every picture I could find, and closed his laptop. Then I went straight to the dorm office, showed them the video, and requested a new roommate immediately. I don't know how the school disciplined John, but I was given a new room across campus the next day. However, my last night with John was the creepiest. I couldn't sleep. At some point, I heard the springs of his mattress creak as he got up, then silence, until I heard a quiet exhale right above my bed. He was standing over me. I was too afraid to turn around. Less than a minute later, I heard the springs again as he went back to bed. The rest of the night was silent. The next morning, I moved out. My new roommate was a breath of fresh air, a normal guy. It's still creepy knowing John has all those pictures of me on his phone. I don't know why he took them, why he stood over my bed that night, or why he went through my bags. The kid was an insane creep, and I'm just glad I got away from him. When I moved out of my parents' house, my dad's friend Kathy offered me a great deal on her apartment. She was subletting it and had 2 bedrooms available. The catch? I'd have to share the place with an older woman she'd found, since Kathy was tight on money. I understood the situation, so I agreed. The day I moved in, Kathy introduced me to Betty, my new roommate. Betty was around 60 years old, which felt a little weird, having a roommate who could almost be my grandma. But the apartment was already furnished, so all I had to bring was my bed and dresser. Things got strange on the second night. I was watching TV in the living room when Betty's head suddenly appeared from behind the hallway wall. She stared at me intently, muttering these faint, strange noises. "Betty, are you okay?" I asked. She just groaned and disappeared back into the hallway. I immediately called Kathy and told her what happened. Kathy said she didn't know of anything wrong with Betty. She'd only met her a week ago. When I described Betty's behavior, Kathy sounded surprised. The next day, I ran into Betty in the kitchen. She was cooking eggs and said good morning like nothing had happened. I asked her if she was okay last night, but she seemed confused. She claimed she had no memory of staring at me or making those noises. At that point, I started to think she might have had some kind of psychotic break. Fast forward through the normal, uneventful days, and things took a turn for the worse. One night, I was lying in bed with my laptop, lights off, when there was a knock at my bedroom door. I muted my laptop and heard the same moaning and groaning sounds Betty had made the night before. I was too uncomfortable to open the door, but since it was unlocked, I figured if something was really wrong, she'd come in. The knocking and moaning went on for what felt like a full minute before I finally heard her walk away. It seemed these episodes only happened at night, and I started wishing I could lock my door. But there was no lock, so I just tried to go back to sleep. Later that night, I woke up to complete darkness. I checked the clock. It was 1:30 a.m. That's when I heard a creak in the room. I saw a figure standing at the edge of my bed. "Betty?" I said. The familiar groaning sound started again. I flipped on the lamp next to my bed, and there she was. Betty, her long gray hair disheveled, looking half awake and completely out of it. But the first thing I noticed was the large knife in her hand. I screamed, scrambling to the corner of my bed, expecting her to attack, but she just stood there making those strange noises before eventually leaving the room. I jumped up, shut the door, and blocked it with my dresser. I tried calling Kathy, but she was obviously asleep. I had to make it through the night. Those 6 hours until sunrise felt like an eternity. At 8 a.m., I called Kathy and explained everything. I told her Betty needed to be evicted immediately. Kathy was shocked but apologized and said she'd come over that day. When she arrived, she spoke to Betty, but evicting her wasn't something that could happen overnight. The process would take months. Kathy suggested it would be best for me to move out and find somewhere else to live while she dealt with Betty. Betty apologized to me, saying she had no memory of what had happened. After some research, Kathy and I figured out that Betty likely had a severe case of sundowning syndrome, a condition that causes confusion, agitation, or even aggression in the late afternoon or evening. It's terrifying to think that in her confused state, Betty might have intended to come into my room and stab me. I'm just glad I got out of there before anything worse happened.